In this video, I'm going to build the best RTX 4060 gaming PC build. No, I can't do this and I won't do this. I'm not doing this. Normally when a new graphics card comes out, I'm the first to race and put together a well-rounded, balanced PC build. But today, that won't be happening. Nvidia have got it so far wrong with the 4060, it's a card that no one should buy for an existing or a new build. So rather than assembling a PC that is sort of pointless, I want to spend the next 10 minutes or so talking about what I think Nvidia got so far wrong with the 4060 and what you should buy instead. Let's do this. The GeekaWhat Aorus 15 lineup is equipped with the latest RTX 40 series GPUs for top tier performance. Plus, with display options up to Quad HD 165Hz, this laptop is a great bet for both high resolution titles and competitive games alike. Plus, with AI accelerated performance in games, including via Nvidia's DLSS 3 and a 13th gen CPU that clocks in at up to 5 GHz, you're sure to be well covered in the frame rate department. Learn more at the first links in the description below. Now, in some respects, this is quite a hard video to make because I wanted the 4060 to be good. It's the mainstream gaming GPU that the average gamer can afford, and at $299, things originally were perhaps looking a little bit promising. But there are so many problems with this card that we need to dissect it bit by bit. Let's start off by looking at raw performance. Yes, it beats out the 3060 Ti in a number of cases, but I'm not being funny, it bloody well should do. And these results were found across a wide range of titles, from brand new games like Hogwarts Legacy to FPS titles like Fortnite and Apex, to titles that sit sort of in the middle, the likes of Call of Duty's Modern Warfare 2 and Warzone 2. In fact, the card that this GPU most closely aligns with in our testing is the 6650 XT. It has beat it sometimes by small margins, but that's a card that can be found for as low as $250. That's 20% less than the 4060. And the problems for the 4060 Ti compound even further when you look at things like video memory. Last generation's 3060 has 12 gigabytes of video memory, so you'd think that the like-for-like replacement 4060 might have the same amount, or maybe even a couple of gigabytes more to see some generational improvements. But no, it has 8 gigabytes, 30% less VRAM than its like-for-like replacement card, a GPU that launched 2 years ago, and the graphics card which this is intended to replace. Now, Nvidia may say, well, most people game at 1080p and you don't really need more than 8 gigabytes of VRAM, but why should the VRAM reduce on a generation by generation basis? What's more, we've got a smaller memory bus than we saw on the last generation, meaning you've also got less bandwidth to the memory. It's bad. I just don't understand the rationale. And if Nvidia's solution is to release a 16 gigabyte version like they have with the 4060 Ti for $100 more, I can tell you right now, it's not gonna work. Now, I suppose there are some positives with the 4060. I mean, it's quite a bit smaller than the last gen 3060 options. This MSI little 2-fan Ventus card is really quite nice. And if anything, I feel sorry for the board partners, MSI, Asus, Gigabyte, because they're only dealing with what they are given in terms of the chip design from Nvidia. Even if this card had more VRAM, even if it had 12 gigabytes of video memory, I'm not entirely convinced it's a card I'd be closely recommending anyway. I mean, heck, I struggled to recommend the 7600 from AMD, a card that is significantly better than this GPU based on its limited VRAM, despite the fact that it costs like $30 less than the 4060. I don't really know what Nvidia were thinking. Now, in some respects, the 4060 isn't really even aimed at people like you and me anyway. I'm sure Nvidia will sell plenty of these to system integrators, where people go and buy a pre-built gaming PC, Nvidia discount the 4060 beyond belief, and the PC building companies are very happy. But I don't really like the idea that a card like this can lean on the great reputation that the 60 tier GPU has earned over the last 5 or even more years, while in the process constraining its potential buyers and end users with VRAM amounts that simply aren't high enough, and frankly, straight rasterization performance that's disappointing. Take DLSS 3 out the equation, turn ray tracing off, and forget about the video memory, and this card still performs worse than an RX 7600, a card with the same amount of video memory that costs $30 less. But let's take a closer look at the numbers, starting off with everyone's favourite first-person shooter. Fortnite, we've tested a massive variety, basically every single card known to man, and you can see the 4060 pulls in 267 FPS. This is more than last gen's 3070 4070 Ti, fairly impressive. A little bit lower than the 3080, but when you compare it to the AMD options, it simply fails quite badly. It beats out the 6650 XT by 3 FPS, which is nothing. That's a card you can buy for $249. It loses out to the 7600 by 6 frames per second, card you can buy for $269. It's just not a particularly good showing in Fortnite, and I'm afraid the results carry on through. Take a look at Warzone 2, and the 4060 beats out the 3060, but falls short to all of its AMD rivals at 1080p. Jump to 1440p, and if anything, it gets worse. It loses out to a 6700 XT, 6750 XT, AMD's own 7600 with 102 FPS. Modern Warfare 2 remastered at 1440p, and the 4060 really struggles. It does pretty much match the 6650 XT, but compared once again to the 7600 and other AMD rivals, and I'm afraid a poor showing. Move through into games like F1 2022, and here it does hold its own a bit better at 1080p when compared with the 6650 XT, but it loses out once again to the 7600 and falls so far behind the 4060 Ti, it's actually quite disappointing. Jump up to 1440p and the card simply can't cope. It's worse than a 3060 Ti, worse than a 7600, and frankly, a little bit embarrassing. Spider-Man Miles Morales is a much better showing thanks to DLSS 3. Perhaps the only saving grace of this card is DLSS 3, but it's something that you shouldn't have to rely on in order to get those good performance figures. Move through into a title like Apex Legends at 1080p and the card pulls in 166 FPS, only 2 frames more than the 3060, less than the 3060 Ti, less than the 6650 XT, less than the 7600. Do I need to go on? Overwatch 2, same story, beats out the 3060 Ti at 1080p but only by a small margin. Hogwarts Legacy, the card holds its own a little bit more, you get a bit more frames than in a 6650 XT, but once again, that's a card that costs 20% less, and it falls slightly short really of AMD's 6750 XT, a card that is a much more compelling buy for maybe what, 20, 30 more US dollars. Now all of this actually makes me quite sad and disappointed, if nothing else because the Nvidia Ada Lovelace architecture is really solid. We saw with the 4090 just what this architecture was capable of. It's a card that AMD themselves still haven't managed to come close to, even with their 7900 XT and XTX. But unfortunately, the 4060 rather paints a picture of the Nvidia 4000 series lineup. A picture that I don't think even the most prolific tech reviewers could have ever envisaged being the case just a couple of years ago. The 4060 is not worth buying, as we've established in this video, and the 4060 Ti had some of the worst GPU reviews I've seen in years. Nvidia's 4070 is okay, but it's frankly a bit too expensive. The 4070 Ti, well, that was a whole palaver, wasn't it, with the whole VRAM situation, and it's basically a 4080 in disguise, and it's all a bit of a mess. The 4080 is not too bad, but once again, AMD's price competitiveness is causing Nvidia to struggle, leaving really only the 4090 to be the card that lacks any controversy and a worthy prize for those of you looking to buy. And I think above all else, what it shows is that Nvidia is sort of out of touch with the market. Yes, people have got less money to spend at the moment, given all the inflationary pressures and recessions and all of those sort of buzzwords that I don't want to dive into the politics of. And that is inevitably reducing sales of components like graphics cards as people prioritize their money elsewhere. But I do not believe for a second that no one wants to buy a graphics card anymore. They do. They just want to buy one at a good price. When I look back to cards like the GTX 1060, a card that really earned its plaudits as a solid 60-tier GPU, I look at this and kind of want to cry. This isn't the same 60-tier GPU that I've been used to. This is a channel that was founded on the back of good value, budget-oriented gaming PC builds. But frankly, I wouldn't even consider this as an option. So I've talked a lot about this card and my thoughts on it, but what should you actually buy instead? I've said that there are other options at the price point, but what are the other options? I've navigated over to a website called Just GPU. It's owned by Newegg, I believe, and it actually is a really good GPU database. Now, if I tune the GPU pricing down, let's say between $227 and between $310, what can you actually buy for less than this card, or maybe $10 more? The 6600 XT is the first card that comes to mind. While not as good as this GPU, it's $70 less at just $230 US. Move up and you can buy a 6650 XT, which provides very similar performance for about $250, while Nvidia are selling their own 3060 with lower rasterization but more video memory for $260 US. AMD's 7600 is a clear winner too, and is perhaps the best like-for-like option over the RTX 4060 if your budget simply cannot stretch past that $300 mark. That's going to come in at $270 and provide plainly better performance. Also, if AMD's track record of GPU price drops is anything to go buy, expect the 7600 to fall further in coming months, especially after the slightly frosty reception it had back when it first launched. But if I take off this price filter and then take a look at the cheapest 67 and 6750 XT GPUs, you can see a 6700 XT here for $29 more than the 4060's MSRP, with 4GB more video memory and about 15-20% in some cases faster straight rasterization performance. The big problem with this card is that it sits in no man's land. At $299 it makes no sense. For $30 or $40 less you can buy a current or last gen card with similar performance and similar specs, while for $20 or $30 more you can buy a card that is simply far better than the 4060. I'm not saying don't buy a GPU from MSI, GeekaWhat or Asus. I'm saying buy a different GPU from these board partners, like this MSI 6700 XT for $339 or an MSI RX 7600 if you really cannot stretch past that $300 price point. This was a hard video to make. It was really disappointing when I tested the 4060 to see the performance figures, especially as someone who's gravitated towards those 60 tier GPUs for entry-level builds for just so long. I'm sure Nvidia will sell plenty of these to system integrators, and in 12 months time I'll look at the Steam hardware survey in bewilderment as to why the 4060 is in anyone's PC. Just a shame. It's a card that could have been so much more. Nvidia, save the silicon and put it into something that's either better value and cost less money, or something more expensive with a bit more performance prowess, because if anything, this is a 4050, not a 4060. That doesn't really matter that I've dropped it, does it? I'm not going to use it again, so...